Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in Game 5 of our coverage of the 2016 World Chess Championship. The first 4 games have all been draws. Last 2 have at least been entertaining. Magnus Carlsen had an advantage in both of them. In Game 3, much bigger advantage. Was unable to find a victory in either of those, but he does have the white pieces in Game 5, so looking to actually get that first win in the tournament. Sergei Karjakin been playing amazing defense, but that's kind of all he's been playing for 4 games now is defense. So he's going to be looking to kind of reverse that role and finally find his first win in the tournament. So we'll go ahead and get started. Magnus Carlsen starting with pawn to e4. Pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, and it almost seemed like this was going to be the tournament of the Ruy Lopez, but we see bishop to c4. So Magnus Carlsen changing it up a bit, playing the Italian game, bishop to c5, going into the quiet game, and then castle on the king side. Now, main line from here would just be to play pawn to c3, then push forward here to d4. Magnus Carlsen deciding to change it up a little bit, castle on the king side, knight here to c6, and then pawn to d3. So eventually Magnus Carlsen, and anyone playing this opening particularly, is eventually going to want to play pawn to d4, but decides he wants to wait a little while, develop his board state a little bit more, and then eventually push forward here to d4. Karjakin castles on the king side, pawn to a4, so Magnus decides to go ahead and push a little bit on the queen side before he starts to push in the center of the board. Pawn to d6, solidifying the pawn chain as well, opening up the door for the light square bishop to get involved into the game. And then this pawn to c3, very important, getting ready to push pawn to d4. Knight to, or pawn to a6, a pawn up here to b4, forcing the bishop back here. And this pawn to a6 is interesting because he has a few options. You could play pawn to a6. You could also play pawn to a5. But then it gets a little tricky, I think, for black, as Magnus Carlsen would play knight to a3, and then look to play knight here to b5, putting a lot of pressure on black side of the board. So I think Karjakin rightfully played pawn to a6. It's one of these small things that you don't think about too much, but I think a lot of preparation went into this pawn to a6 move. But pawn to b4, recognizing he's not going to be taking his knight out right away since he can't come here to b5. But pawn here to b4, bishop comes back a7, a rook over here to e1, protecting this pawn in the center of the board. Karjakin continues with knight to e7, and notice when the knight was on c6, it's defending this central square of d4. Very important square in this opening, especially with this bishop here on a7. Everything is kind of gearing up for an attack in the center of the board once Magnus Carlsen pushes forward with pawn here to d4. As soon as this knight moves, though, Magnus Carlsen needs to start figuring out how he wants to attack the center of the board. It would be a mistake if he attacked right away. Pawn to d4. We could see an exchange right here. Bishop down to a g4, pinning down the knight. If you try to kick this knight away, let's say pawn to h3, we could just take on here on f3 if the queen recaptures, which he needs to. Then this bishop would take on d4, does not have the protection that he needs. So he doesn't want to do that right away. But first he decides to go ahead and play knight to d2. This is nice because now if there ever is a pin down here with the bishop on g4, he could actually protect it with the knight. He could recapture and still have his queen protecting the center of the board, not have to worry about his queen recapturing here on f3. So he did kind of wait for his opponent before he played this knight to d2, because generally he would be looking to get his bishop involved into the game and then push forward, but decided not to do that. Now after knight to g6, then Magnus Carlsen decides, okay, I can go ahead and push forward with d4. And it's anytime you look at this openings, you know, some of the moves look somewhat complicated. Some of them look very basic, but you can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you're playing lines that you're not familiar with and you're not really sure when you should push forward, when you should get your knight involved into the game, what you're looking from your opponent. So if you have different openings that you play, make sure you study them and you're aware with all these different nuances that your opponent can play. So pawn to c6, Karjakin says, I'm going to go ahead and kind of play a similar game as you. I can push forward with pawn to d4 if I need to. He does have this knight and now this pawn protection as well as this queen back here to attack if he wants to. Pawn to h3. Magnus Carlsen doesn't want to have to worry about the bishop ever coming here. Even the knight from f6 coming down here to g4. So it kind of puts a stop to that. Pawn takes on d4, so we do have our exchange on board. Pawn to d4, and the knight to e4. Very interesting move in the game. Decides to go ahead and take this pawn. It looks almost weird because you could just take the back with the knight here on e4. And Magnus Carlsen does have this option, but very important to note, if he takes with the knight, then pawn to d5. This is going to take one of these pieces on board. You can see the bishop come back here to b3. Let's say pawn takes here. All of a sudden, the rook could recapture, and they're kind of even in material on board. Magnus Carlsen has that option. He decided to go a different route and take here on f7. Now, after the rook takes, then the knight can come up here to e4. Very central knight on the board. They're equal in material right now. This is how Magnus Carlsen decided. I don't know which way is necessarily better, but Magnus Carlsen decided that this was the path that he wanted to choose. Pawn to d5, and the knight over here to c6. And Karjakin kind of has a decision to make. He has a double bishop pair. Magnus Carlsen gave him that when he sacrificed his bishop up here on f7. So he could kind of hold on to that if he wants to, or he could just go ahead and say, hey, this is a nice little outpost for this knight. I don't want to have to worry about this. I'm going to go ahead and take here on c5. He decides to go ahead and hold on to it, plays pawn to h6, a very critical square here on g5 to hold on to, especially since this dark square bishop has not gotten involved into the game at all. Rook here to a3, protecting this knight. Since the knight's come up here to c5, just want to make sure he has additional protection on this knight on f3. Also, if he ever wants to swing his rook over into the king side of the board, his opponent has this f pawn gone, so he could maybe potentially think about an attack on the king side of the board. So bishop to f5, just getting it centrally involved into the game, and the knight up here to e5. So both of these knights very active. One's attacking this knight here on f7. Karjakin takes the knight on e5. We do have a recapture on e5. And now both sides have a passed pawn. White has a passed pawn here on e5. And then black has a passed pawn on d5. It's actually a protected passed pawn. It has the pawn here on c6 protecting it. So both sides are going to be looking to push that. I do think it's going to be tough for either side to actually push too much because there's just so much material on board to block or attack that. But they have that option. At least you have to keep that in mind anytime there is a passed pawn. Now the queen comes down here to h4, and this is, I think, a pretty good move from Karjakin. It puts a lot of pressure on his opponent because Magnus Carlsen, this pawn is now under attack here on b4. If this pawn were to move for any reason, the knight would fall on c5, so that's going to be bad. Also has to keep in mind if he moves this knight, he doesn't have too many great squares to move it to, but then this bishop and this queen are both attacking this pawn here on f2, so that's going to be bad. Something like knight to b3 is devastating with bishop down to f2. This is actually forced mate it, and not too long, things get pretty bad. If we see even knight to d3, then all of a sudden we could see bishop takes here, and then we still have that threat of the bishop coming down here to f2. We could also see queen down to f2. It is being protected by the rook here on f7. So all in all, it's pretty bad. So Magnus Carlsen decides the best way to defend this is actually to get a little bit aggressive and play rook to f3 and says, you can take my pawn all you want. I'm going to go ahead and take your bishop. So now Karjakin decides to go ahead and exchange material. Bishop takes here on c5, pawn recaptures, and then rook over here to e8, attacking this pawn right here. So Magnus Carlsen's got 3 pawn chains. Sometimes it can be a little more difficult to defend multiple pawn chains. Sergei Karjakin probably has a little better pawn structure on board. He has 2 on the queen side. It's very, very strong with 4 altogether. Rook up here to f4, attacking the queen. Queen comes back here to e7. Queen to d4, since this pawn was under attack, as well as this pawn here on c5 that didn't have any protection. Rook to f8, just double barreling these rooks here on the f-file. Rook down here to f3, just adding a little layer of protection with the pawn here on g2. Bishop e4 attacking the rook, decides to go ahead and exchange material here on f7. Pawn to f3, forcing the bishop back here, and then king to h2. So if we kind of look on both sides of the board, I would say Karjakin, maybe a small advantage. His pieces look a little more active. I would say he has, the advantage over on the queen side. I think it's going to be very difficult for Magnus Carlsen to do too much with his pawn here on e5. But all in all, there's not a clear path to victory. They have opposite color bishops. That's usually going to end up in a more drawless situation. They do have major pieces on board, but there's not really a clear advantage for either side of the board. Karjakin plays bishop to e6, just coming back, protecting the pawn here, opening up the door for the queen to get a little bit more involved. For rook to e2. Queen down here, a g6, bishop to e3. Rook here to f7, rook to f2. So both sides just consolidating material over on the king side, and then queen to b2. So Karjakin decides to go ahead and get material behind enemy lines. It is going to be fairly tough to really attack too much and do anything. This is an aggressive move, so it's always good to just put more pressure on your opponent. But unless you have more material, the queen by itself, especially when Magnus Carlsen has so much material to defend, it's going to be tough to really do much with that. Rook over here to b2, attacking the queen. The queen comes back here to f5. Okay, so that was shortly lived. Pawn up here to a5. Just getting these pawns on opposite colors of this light square bishop, so it kind of just negates any of the attacking presence this light square bishop could have, and that's usually what you see with bishops on opposite colors. You have all these light square pawns over here. This bishop's not going to be doing too much, especially if you kind of lock these up. Then neither bishop can even get around that, so it does negate a lot of their mobility. Queen back here to c3, king to e8, rook to b4. So it says, yeah, I can start to get this involved into the action. Bring it over here to the king side of the board. Pawn down here, g5. So Karjakin decides to go ahead and start and push a little bit. He doesn't have as many pawns as Magnus Carlsen, but he decides he has more material getting ready to be involved into the game. So decides to push. King here to d8. Rook over here, f2. King c8. Queen up here, d4. Queen to g6. So both sides just slowly finding a position that they like on board. They're also approaching the 40-minute or the 40 move mark, which they get additional time. They're in about 37 moves right now, and they don't have tons of time left on their clock. So in this particular case, you're not going to see as many deep moves. You're going to see more of just a consolidation, just try to slowly improve their position, but nothing too crazy usually happening at these last moves near move 40. Pawn up here to g4, pawn to h5, so looking to kind of blow this up. Queen back here to d2. Rook here to g7, king to g3, just adding another piece of material involved into the action. Rook here to g8, king back here to g2. And Magnus Carlsen could have tried other things beside king here to g2, but there's not too many things that are going to be really great on this board presence. You know, king to g2 after he was just here on h2 is not extremely aggressive, but he could decide to take material if he wanted to. You know, maybe push forward with pawn to f4, try to blow up that side. He does have a lot of presence with the bishop, the queen, and the rook. I could try something like that. But all in all, besides to play king here to g2, pawn takes on g4, recaptures would be a little trickier if he retook on g4 with this pawn, because then all of a sudden queen down here, e4 check, just puts too much pressure on Magnus Carlsen. Doesn't want to have to deal with that. So recaptures with his h-pawn. Now pawn down here to d4. This is one of those that kind of had myself scratching my head. I don't think you have to give up this material. Queen takes here on d4, and he plays bishop to d5. Now this is a great outpost, don't get me wrong, but I don't think you have to give up your pawn in this particular case. He had other options on board. Could have played queen to h6, try to get behind enemy lines, rook over here to h8, and then maybe push on the king side. I think that's way better than just giving up a pawn, but decides to go ahead and give up a pawn here on d4, queen here to d4, bishop to d5. I do like this outpost though, and then Magnus Carlsen says, you know what, you were kind enough, I'm going to go ahead and give that pawn back to you as well. I don't think Magnus Carlsen had to do this as well. I think he had other options, maybe just king to g3. It's kind of a quiet move, but he doesn't have to give up that material right away. But he decides, okay, pawn to e6, my passed pawn, I'll go ahead and give it back. Queen takes on e6, that's fine. Now king to g3, I think a move too late. Queen to e7, rook over here to h1, trying to control this open file on the king side of the board. Queen to f7. f4, we do see an exchange. Queen takes on f4. Queen to e7, so Karjakin's not ready to give up the exchange right away. Rook to h5, attacking the bishop, but not really doing too much. Does have this outpost, and there's no way to kick this off, especially since his opponent has an opposite colored bishop. This bishop's not going anywhere on board. So rook here to f8, attacking the queen. Magnus Carlsen says, yeah, you can go ahead and take my queen. I'll just come up here and take yours. So we do see an exchange on board, and at this particular spot, they decided to draw the game. So 5 games, 5 draws. We come back tomorrow. Sergei Karjakin has the white pieces. Hopefully one of these players can break through. I don't think this was maybe as exciting as the past two, but I was happy to see Magnus Carlsen at least tried a new opening. I wish he'd maybe try something a little more aggressive than the quiet game. But all in all, high-level chess, always good to watch. One of these players I do think will end up winning before we get to kind of a tiebreaker where they play, rapid and blitz chess. But hopefully you guys are enjoying the tournament even with all the draws. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all tomorrow.